Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tomiko Brown-Nagin, Dean of the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University. I'm pleased to welcome you to the first in our series of summer virtual book talks, and I hope you'll join us again in the coming weeks. This series follows our virtual Radcliffe discussions exploring health equity in the time of COVID, and the videos of those programs are now available on our website. Before we begin today's talk, I want to acknowledge the members of the Radcliffe Institute Leadership Society and all our annual donors. Your generosity keeps Radcliffe programming free and open to the public, and we thank you. Today, I'm very glad to introduce Maggie Doherty, a literary scholar and critic here at Harvard, and author of the new book, The Equivalents. Maggie's book was very meaningful for many of us here at the Institute, since it chronicles a fascinating and important period in the history of our institutional predecessor, Radcliffe College's Institute for Independent Study. Maggie's fascinating book explores the nature of fellowship, collaboration, and competition among 5 path-breaking artists in the earliest Radcliffe Institute classes: the poets Sexton and Maxine Kumin, the painter Barbara Swan, the sculptor Mariana Panetta, and the writer Tillie Olsen. Thank you, Maggie, for joining us. I'm delighted to have you here. We'll begin this afternoon with a brief reading, followed by a conversation. After that, we look forward to responding to your questions. Please use the Q&A feature on Zoom to submit your questions, and you can do so at any time during the program. We also ask you to make sure your questions are in fact questions, and that you keep them brief to allow as many people as possible to participate. And now it is my pleasure to give the virtual floor to Maggie Doherty.
Thank you so much, Dean Brown-Nagin, and thank you everyone associated with the Institute who helped facilitate today's event. I am thrilled to be here and so honored to be part of what looks like an amazing event series. I also just want to thank everyone at the Institute who's been involved with both this event and this book in a very real way. This book would not exist without the Institute, not just because this is a book about those early years of the Institute for Independent Study, but also because the book draws so heavily on materials and histories that the Radcliffe Institute keeps for scholars to use today. So I want to thank especially the librarians at the Schlesinger Library, especially Ellen Shea and Diana Carey, who were absolutely instrumental in my research for this book, as well as Meg Grotzel, who I have been in conversation with about fellowship and the arts at Radcliffe for several months now. So it's really fitting and exciting to get to talk about this book here today and with this audience. I'm going to read a little bit from the book, and I was thinking about the passage I wanted to read. I wanted it to be something that really illustrates the community that developed in these early years of the Institute for Independent Study. This is a book that's fundamentally about community and argues in a way for the significance of networks and institutions in creative life. No one is really a sculptor alone. No one is really a writer alone. A writer has readers. A writer is in dialogue with other writers. A painter needs a model. These are very social relationships, even though we often think of them as solitary. So the scene and the passage that I picked to start off today is from the very first seminar talk. During that first year of the Institute, the academic year 1961 to 1962. And the first talk, which was delivered to all 22, fellows in the audience that day, was by the poets Maxine Kumin and Sexton. These 2 poets were best friends. They both lived in Newton. They both were mothers of small children, and they had been collaborating kind of unbeknownst to anyone else at the Institute since they met in a writing workshop in Boston in the late 1950s. The scene that I'm taking it from is the end of this seminar talk, and Sexton was the second presenter that day. And there was a little bit of a Q&A afterward, just as we'll have today. So I'm going to pick up, this is chapter 7 in the book. And I'm going to begin with where Anne Sexton was ending. She closed her talk with The Fortress, her poem for Linda, her daughter. It was her first time reading it in public. She described how she had gotten a ghastly backache while writing the poem because she had spent days at her desk, working straight from 8 in the morning until 11 at night. I was working on it, my kids were running around, and the cleaning woman ran in and out. Dinner wasn't ready, and my husband came home, and that's no example of how you're supposed to act as a wife, she said apologetically. K.O. had stolen a secretary's chair from his office the very next day. He understood her need to concentrate. It might not be the traditional behavior of a wife, but it was the behavior of an artist or a scholar. It was an experience that many women at the Institute would recognize. It's for all of us, Sexton announced when the poem was over. Us mothers, the graduate mothers. The Fortress was the final poem that Sexton read that afternoon. 30 minutes after she'd started reading, she declared that the poets were done. The poets had revealed themselves to be two different people after all. Turn off the tape, someone yelled, but the recording continued. Tea was passed. After some time, wine was poured. Sexton helped herself. I don't really think a wine cellar makes an alcoholic necessarily, she said to no one in particular. Like an orchestra starting up, the audience came to life. Some directed questions at the poets, others engaged in side conversation. Someone complained about a local paper's coverage of the Institute. We're not rusty mothers. Sexton and Kumin disagreed. They both had periods of latency. We did get rusty, Sexton admitted. Now they were back at their desks. Their children resented them at times, but they also benefited from being exposed to art. Sexton's children, though young, knew what a poem was. It's what your mummy types all day. Sometimes Sexton felt like a question was too heady for her, and she would ask Kumin to help her answer. At some point during the discussion, someone asked Sexton about her self-critical process. How do you know when something is finished? Oh, that's the most complicated process, Sexton replied, and paused. Then, I call it Maxine and I ask her. Her audience hooted and laughed. Sexton went on to describe their work routine, the daily phone sessions, the callbacks. Kumin chimed in. We've been doing this for years, long before Radcliffe. We didn't let Radcliffe know when we applied that we knew each other, Kumin said. We figured they wouldn't want us if they knew. They had applied very separately, these two women who were each other's superegos, their critical selves. But now the secret was out. They acknowledged publicly, for the first time, the central role they played in each other's creative lives. If they had been worried about how their secret would be received, they needn't have been. The scholars were charmed. After a semester at the Institute, the women all saw the value of a supportive female friend, someone who could give you notes on your work and advice about your youngest child. The two poets performed the kind of mutual support that all the Institute women would recognize. Their confession made, the poets continued to speak, but they were soon drowned out by waves of affectionate laughter. At one point, Kumin recalled a fight with her middle daughter, Judith, which ended when Judith slipped a note under her door. Dear Mrs. Kumin, I think your books are bad. The plots are terrible and the rhymes are worse. Yours sincerely, a well-wisher. The other mothers laughed. They understood.
Thank you so much for that, Maggie. That was such an evocative reading. And we're definitely going to get to the question of friendship and community, but I want to start with the archives. As an historian, I love the archives, and I especially love the collections of the Schlesinger Library here at Radcliffe, where you conducted research for the book. I wondered if you could spend a few minutes telling us about your experience at the Schlesinger and how you approached the task of uncovering and documenting the equivalence experience at Radcliffe.
So I first got the idea for this book in the archive, literally sitting there in Schlesinger Library, which, by the way, is a beautiful place to work. I miss it especially now that I'm sitting here in my stepson's bedroom, which is now my workspace, and, you know, all of the sort of juggling that we're all doing right now. I had been interested in the writer Tillie Olsen. I was a graduate student at the time, and I learned that she'd spent time at the Radcliffe Institute. So I just decided to look in those records and see what I could find about her life. And I was struck as I started going through the records of the Radcliffe Institute. I think they're officially categorized under the Bunting Institute, if you're actually looking in the finding aid and looking to find the actual files. But I learned how many women artists and writers that I admired or knew about and knew were incredibly significant to literary history and art history had spent time at the Institute. And so my question as a writer and as a historian was, what was it like? What was the atmosphere like at a place like this? And that's where the archive could be incredibly helpful, not just in terms of the nitty gritty of, how much money did each fellow get? When did they have these seminar talks? Was there food at the seminar talks? In fact, there was. The director baked homemade baked goods for them. But also, what were the kinds of ideas exchanged? Where did people tend to hang out? What did it sound like when all of these women were so excited to meet each other and start talking? And the most exciting source for me that I used in the archive was the sound recordings of these seminar talks.
Oh, wow.
So in the moment when someone yells, "turn off the tape," they're referring to the tape of the seminar, which Constance Smith, the first director of the Institute, had this hunch that historians were going to be interested in what happened that afternoon. And so she recorded the talk, and she pressed record and said, "we're recording history here," which indeed they were. So when I wanted to know, what did it feel like to be in a room that was kind of hard to find in the early 1960s for women like this. I had this amazing resource, and I sat there in the Schlesinger Library with headphones on, an old cassette player, because they're all on sort of typical tape cassettes, and I just listened to all of the conversation, the laughter, the jokes, the readings that people gave, the presentations people gave. And I feel so lucky. I mean, this is really a historian's kind of dream source, the source that actually takes you right back into the time that you're trying to learn more about. So all of the archival material from Schlesinger was incredibly helpful in shaping this story. But I think that experience of really getting back into that room while sitting simultaneously in Schlesinger Library kind of was one of the most exciting research experiences that I could ever imagine having.
Oh, wonderful. Well, the immediacy that you described definitely comes through in the book. Thank you for talking about that. I want to focus on the way in which you describe the Radcliffe experience as a tipping point, or defining even transformational moment in the careers of the equivalents. And of course, the appointment was especially important for these people who were not traditional academics and so who did not have support from universities. I want you to speak a bit to how unusual the opportunity was for non-traditional talent, particularly women, to have access to a major university at the time, and why did Polly Bunting think the program was important?
So Polly Bunting had come up with this idea for what she called a messy experiment before even she was officially in charge of Radcliffe College. So she had been the dean at Douglas College, the women's college associated with Rutgers University, and had gotten really interested in women's education because she noted this sort of odd fact that women were going to college in the 1950s. Lots of women were going to college. More women were going to college than ever. But very few of them were going on to pursue the sorts of fields that they studied. The average age, I think, of marriage for women was about 20. They were having kids and dropping out of college or finding a way to kind of finish up college at the time, and not really sure what they were supposed to do with this college education when they were spending most of their time in the home. And when their children were grown, and they were grown and sort of out of the house by the time these women were in their mid-30s, they didn't really have a next step. So Bunting had this idea that if you could find a way to get women back into their intellectual pursuits, their creative pursuits, their scholarly pursuits at this time in their mid-30s, when the pressures of child-rearing and homemaking were a little bit lessened, then they would begin to produce the kind of art and scholarship that they were capable of, and that, in her view, the nation really needed. That she was very much a product of this Cold War moment where she thought it very silly that we were only drawing on the brain power and innovation of roughly half the population. So the Institute was her brainchild, and it was this idea that if you gave 24, the first class was 24 women, access to university resources, a stipend that they could use in whatever way they thought would help facilitate their work, office space, and association or community with other like-minded scholars and artists, they would be galvanized. They would be able to jumpstart something that they had left dormant for a little while. There was nothing like this in the nation at the time that the Institute was announced, which was in November 1960. And you can tell just how groundbreaking it was when you look at the volume of responses they got to this idea when it first came out in the New York Times. The phone at the Institute headquarters is just ringing nonstop. I think they had to hire additional assistants in order to actually answer the phone during those first weeks after the announcement. Letters are pouring in from all over the country from women in all different class positions, of all different educational backgrounds, all of whom are so excited about this idea. A lot of them want to come. They really hope they can come, but some are just saying, congratulations, what an incredible idea. Thank you so much for doing this. Here's $5 if that will help. I really want to see this come to fruition. And there just wasn't really that kind of community, that sort of female community that was creative and intellectual and scholarly. That wasn't the kind of thing that you could stumble upon very easily as a woman in the 1950s. And there also wasn't that much material and institutional support at the time for, as you said, non-traditional thinkers and writers and artists. You could take a seminar with Robert Lowell if you wanted to improve your writing, or you could go apprentice at an atelier in France if you wanted to work on your sculpting. But that didn't actually give you the resources that so many writers and artists and thinkers need to do their work. You need, someone to watch the children. You need a space, a room of your own to actually get your work done. And Bunting had, on some level, understood that and offered a program that met all of those individual needs. It came out of her own life, in part, because she had had this kind of perfect mix of homemaking and research. She was a microbiologist by training, and when her husband did his residency at Yale, she was able to use the Yale labs part-time. So she was home with her 4 kids, and then a few days in the week she was going into New Haven and doing her research, and she thought, that's it, that's the ideal mix. Not everyone agreed. Not everyone who would go to the Institute actually thought that was the ideal mix. Some people wanted way more of one thing and way less of the other. But the model that she used was this model that sort of suggested, A, you do need support in order to do your work and make art and create scholarship. And B, you shouldn't have to choose between raising a family, being invested in your family, and pursuing creative or intellectual ideas that you've nurtured for a long time. So I think the Institute in many ways remains really groundbreaking in its recognition of these facts. I think these are, questions and problems that we're all still struggling with today.
Of course. Thank you for that comment. And of course, the Institute, the fellowship class for many years has been majority women. So we're continuing to advance that mission. I want to go back, Maggie, to your reference to networks. The exchange of ideas within the networks developed at the Institute and the ways that a sense of community can contribute to professional growth are central ideas in your book. I wonder if you could speak more about the importance of the networks you explored in the book and about the complexities of the relationships that formed among the women you described, the tensions among them.
It's true. I mean, this is in so many ways such a celebration of this group of friends and this moment in the Institute's history. But of course, it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. Artists are competitive. They do sort of, worry about not being appreciated or falling behind. But to take your first question about networks, I think one thing that the Institute did that was so sort of central to the advance of the 5 women that I talk about, but also all of the women who attended the Institute in those early years, was, find a way where information could be passed, necessary information for advancing and getting your work done among women who might not have otherwise had access to that information. I interviewed the daughter of the writer Tillie Olsen, and she recalled, she came to Cambridge when her mother and father came, and she recalled going into the Yellow House on Mount Auburn Street, where all the women had their offices and where the seminar talks were delivered, and listening to these conversations that they were having. And she was very insistent with me. She said they did talk a little bit about their families. They talked, there was a little bit of gossip, but they were talking really, really seriously about how to get your work done and how to get it published, how to get it seen. And so she would recall, two women going off in the corner and saying, well, have you tried this press? I know someone at that press. I worked with them before. They're great. Let me pass along your manuscript. Or, do you have an agent? How did you get your agent? All the conversations that I've had trying to kind of make my way as a writer. And it's not like there's just some, bulletin board where you can go to find these things out. You often need people who are in the know somehow, who are in positions of power, or even who are not in positions of power, but are more established in some way to help facilitate these connections. So the kind of professionalism of these networks was really significant and not something that a lot of these fellows have been able to find on their own. I'm especially interested in the book because the book is about 5 artists in the nature of creative networks, which are often competitive. And one thing that I found interesting about this group is because they were working across media and across genre, there was more mutual inspiration than there was competition. So there's this amazing seminar talk that the painter Barbara Swan attends. It's delivered by Anne Sexton. It's the next year at the Institute. And Sexton reads a poem she wrote that was inspired by one of Swan's lithographs. And she had gotten kind of fixated on this lithograph that Swan had made. She'd hung it in her living room, and she was kind of circling the living room and staring at it and coming back to it. And she wrote this very sort of mystical poem, very allegorical. It's a journey to the center of the earth. There are musicians playing. It's a very, very strange poem. She was very embarrassed to read it. She kept apologizing for it. And Swan is in the audience listening to it. And then when Sexton's done talking, she stands up with a painting and says, oh, I've done a painting now in response to your poem. And so I think because the Institute brought together artists in very different media and in different sort of circles, there was less anxiety about sort of eliminating each other or about competing with each other, but actually there was this really interesting cross-pollination and collaboration. There was still competition, certainly. I think that's most, in this book, it's most visible or it's most sort of resonant between the 2 poets, in part because they're both the 2 poets, and they were often called by other women at the Institute the poets. That's how they were kind of introduced to people. They had different high points in their careers. They also had a kind of caretaking relationship between the 2 of them that could sometimes complicate the creative collaboration that they engaged in. So Sexton really started off her career incredibly successful and was sort of a natural at poetry. Kumin found success much later at a time when Sexton was really struggling to create new work. And so that was a more complicated relationship, perhaps, than what you see between Sexton and Swan or between Pineda and Olsen. So that element was definitely present. The Institute did a lot to form community, but of course, it's never going to fully eliminate the little rivalries and jealousies and sort of misunderstandings that just happen among artistic crowds.
Yes, of course. I want to ask you about a passage where you write, the Institute provided the equivalents with a refuge, but then it pushed them back into the world for better and for worse. Can you comment on what you mean by for better and for worse in that context?
Well, I mean, I think in a way this is so resonant now as we all sit isolated in our particular locations right now, where it's very, very hard to sustain community. right? Like it's there, people move, people's lives change. And what was so important for the women that I talk about in my book was finding this community that they didn't expect to find. For all of them, it was a really rich and creative period in their lives. It was a very bright period for all 5 of them. But it couldn't last. Like there's a kind of almost lost utopia feeling to the end of the Institute for some of them, where it's really, really hard to recreate these conditions independently without any kind of institution sort of mediating and facilitating this. So when their time at the Institute was over, they had to kind of go back to their old lives, which were often kind of isolated and far away from each other. Olsen was from San Francisco. She moved for the 2 years of her Institute fellowship, and she really wanted to stay. She loved New England. I mean, she loved San Francisco, and it generated so much inspiration for her fiction. But she loved the bookstores here. She loved Grollier's poetry shop. She actually bought way too many books there and couldn't kind of pay her bill for all the books she was buying. She loved the history of New England. And she was lucky, or she got some extra funding to stay another summer. But then she had to go back to the West Coast. And everyone else in this group of 5 that I discussed were all Boston-based. So she had to go back and kind of go back to her old life, had to go back with her family and her sort of odd jobs. And she was really lonely. She wrote a lot of notes. She called a lot and didn't always get through. She would make little cards, would include pieces of bark or pussy willow, little flowers, just, something that I think could seem a little strange maybe to the recipient, but is also very sweet and kind of plaintive to me, just the visual representation of a desire to connect, sent in the mail in this way. So I think, the struggle for all of us as individuals is, how do we sustain connection? How do we sustain community? And when it's lost, how can we recover it? Or how does it have to change in some way in order to accommodate new circumstances? I think for some of the women I talk about, this period at the Institute was really irreplaceable and was really kind of a high point in their personal lives and creative lives, and they couldn't quite get it back afterward. Even as some of them, like Kumin, who I mentioned a moment ago, went on to find much more success afterward. So it wasn't a kind of consistent trajectory for all 5 women. Some found great success immediately after, some found success a decade after. Some were really lonely initially and then found new connections and new friends at a later date. Some really didn't at all. So everyone kind of had a different aftermath in some ways, which is a challenge as a writer when you're trying to trace 5 different people on their different paths after a time together.
Right. Thank you so much for that. I want to pan out for a minute and situate the equivalence in history. And that's because you argue that the conventional understanding and timeline of the women's liberation movement misses the important contributions of women like the equivalents. Could you expand on that claim?
I mean, I am certainly not alone in arguing this. I think a lot of really wonderful historians have questioned or nuanced what we sometimes think of as the wave model of feminism, where there's kind of a first wave in the 1920s around, the right to vote, and then the second wave of American feminism is associated with the women's liberation movement and with fighting for abortion rights, fighting against sort of an unequal division of household labor, fighting for equal protection under the law for employment, an end to sex-based hiring, stuff like that. And then these third and fourth waves that occur in the late 90s and maybe sort of currently, which also have different concerns, different goals, different ways of thinking about the question of what is feminism. Many excellent historians have noted that there's a lot of interpenetration among these different movements, that actually activists from one movement are still participating in the next wave of the movement, especially if you look at the history of working class feminism, feminists who are also labor activists. There's a lot of consistency across the decades in terms of the issues they're fighting for and the way that they're conceiving of women and women's rights and what it means to fight for women's rights. Same if you look at the history of Black feminist organizing, there is probably more continuity than this wave model gives credit to. I think the reason that this story felt so necessary to me, if we're thinking about how we conceptualize feminist history, is maybe for two reasons. So one, which is a kind of individual point, is that Betty Friedan and the feminine mystique are often seen as a real groundbreaking moment in feminist history, that this is a book that really changed the conversation and kind of started something. And it was an incredibly significant book for the women in my book and for many, many women across the country. But the ideas for that book and the conversation that that book seemed to start was actually going on much earlier. And in the case of the Institute, one thing that's interesting is that Polly Bunting and Betty Friedan were collaborating on the book initially. The two of them were going to author the book together. This is in the late 1950s when Bunting is dean at Douglas College. And they were both thinking, as many, many education reformers and scholars and writers were thinking at the time, that we needed a better way of thinking about women's lives than what we currently had. Bunting and Friedan ended up parting ways, in part because Friedan was too angry for Bunting, who was the child of a Quaker mother and was a very moderate temperament. But I think the Institute kind of shows in the ways that it was thinking about changing women's lives and women's trajectories, it sort of shows a little bit of the influence of Friedan, and maybe Friedan's book shows a little bit of the influence of Bunting, but there's an earlier story to the feminine mystique. I think, I think that's actually a good place to leave it.
Sure. Thank you. I want to get to your mention of race at a couple of points. You call attention to the fact that the messy experiment at Radcliffe was both strikingly progressive intervention for women and also exclusionary. So the folks who you talk about initially were overwhelmingly white, middle class to upper class women. And I wonder if you can speak to that tension. It's one that many members of the audience are interested in as well.
Yes, I mean, that the way that the Institute initially selected its fellows was according to this idea of talent. And this idea of talent was not neutral. So by which I mean, there was a very specific type of woman who was going to meet the idea of a talented, brilliant, gifted woman who deserved this kind of opportunity. And this is even kind of baked into the application materials in some way. So the application asked for the applicant to have either a PhD or, and this is where the book gets its title, the equivalent of artistic training and accomplishment. So if you were Barbara Swan and you had done an MFA at the School of the Museum of Fine Arts, that was your equivalent to the PhD. But of course, those credentials were not equally accessible to women or to people generally in America at the end of the 1950s and the beginning of the 1960s. So there already was a very kind of specific person that this program was targeting. And, you know, in part because Bunting was modeling the program on her own life, she really did have a kind of desire to see some part of herself in some way mirrored in the women that she was accepting into the Institute. The article that announces it in the New York Times in 1960 actually talks about the type of woman. It says the applicant that we're imagining probably had a one-woman gallery show in her 20s and now has 2 kids and hasn't had an exhibition since. And, you know, they were really kind of crafting a particular person. One of the reasons I think Tillie Olsen is such an important voice in this book is because she really challenged that definition of talent. She was a working class labor activist who had never gone to college and had a really different understanding of what constituted creativity and talent and intelligence, and kind of brought that into the Institute. So initially in these early years that the book focuses on, there was a pretty limited idea of who would get these sorts of fellowships. And of course, the women who did get them often were hiring household help and childcare, and that was disproportionately done, as it still is, by women of color. So there was a certain irony to that dynamic if we're thinking about this as a program that advances women's lives, right? So some women's lives are being advanced in one way, and some women are sort of being relied on or leaned on to kind of pick up all the necessary care work that these women are not doing themselves. This changed actually, not that long after the Institute was founded. So by the late 1960s, there's a lot of activism on Harvard's campus and at Radcliffe College around race and admissions. Students are occupying buildings. There's pressure on the university administration to admit more Black students, to hire more Black faculty, and that informs what the Institute's doing as well. So one chapter in my book is about Alice Walker's years at the Institute. She was one of the first Black women to have a fellowship at the Institute, and the work that she did there that actually is sort of part of all of the work that she's done to sort of increase the visibility of Black women's writing, both in her own present moment, but also in the past, all the kind of women that she was bringing to the attention of students and readers through her essays and her research.
Terrific. And I'm glad you included that chapter on Alice Walker. Of course, there would have been many talented women of color at the time. There's this question about where one looks, and it's still resonant, of course, now as we think about women and access to the resources of universities and other parts of society. I want to move on and ask you a question. Now that we've talked a lot about what's included in the book, I want to ask you a question about some of the hard choices you made in the book, as every author does. Now, one of the exclusions I noticed was the decision to avoid mention of Anne Sexton's sexual abuse of her daughter, Linda. That exclusion struck me as striking and notable, rather, because Sexton's own experience of sexual and physical abuse is prominently covered in the book, and the relationship between motherhood and work is also central to the book. I wonder if you can just say a little bit about what was behind that decision.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I want to say, of course, that I've read I've read Linda Sexton's account of this both in her own memoir and Diane Middlebrook's wonderful biography of Anne Sexton, which I think was also completed or she worked on it while she was at the Butting Institute, talks about this really sensitively and in depth. And I would point anyone who wants to know more about this or wants a really sort of fair and sensitive account to Middlebrook's biography. My book, although it talks about the lives of these women, is really about their relationships more than about their individual lives. So there's actually, a lot that gets left out. There's not much about their marriages as, someone might want to know. There's some stuff about their relationships with their children, but there's definitely so much more I could say about them. And I guess the way I was thinking about it as a writer is about the kind of context in which I'm putting these 5 figures. What is the context for this story? And the context is friendship and relationships among 5 women. And so I guess the way you could think about this is I'm writing them sort of the way they saw each other. How did they view each other? Mm-hmm. So primarily they viewed each other as friends, collaborators, interlocutors, rivals, pen pals, sort of alter egos, super egos. And that's what I had in my mind as I was writing. So how does Tillie Olsen look to Anne Sexton? How does Anne Sexton look to Maxine Kumin? How does Marianna Pineda look to Barbara Swan? And that was kind of the vision or perspective through which they were, through which I was trying to write these five women. So for that reason, a lot of the sort of things that you might find in a more standard cradle to grave biography that would talk more about their grandparents or talk about their family life, talk about their all the sort of like personal details that make good biography so good are not part of the story. But I hope what is part of the story, or I hope what readers can get from the story, is something else, which is how do women relate to each other? How do they view each other? What is the kind of communal or social world that these women participated in?
Mm-hmm. Great. So Maggie, there are many audience questions. I folded some into my questions, and I want to ask you a few more. One audience member wants to know how the fellowship was perceived by literary institutions and prestigious communities, particularly that the woman-only aspect of the fellowship reduced the prestige of it.
That's such a great question. So I think because it was a Radcliffe College program, it got a lot of press when it was first announced, and it was seen as really prestigious because Radcliffe was one of the Seven Sisters colleges. It definitely had a reputation as being one of the sort of best educational institutions in the country. And so when the institute's announced, it's covered all over the country. Newspapers are generally really attentive and sort of celebratory in their coverage. And there was overall a real respect for the initiative. And I mention that in part because there were similar initiatives at the time at other institutions. There was one at the University of Minnesota. Bunting had done a program at Douglas that was a kind of continuing education program. And precisely because those programs were not marketed as we're finding the best and the brightest, we're finding the most brilliant, they didn't necessarily have the same kind of prestige or national attention. One irony I learned in my research was that in the early years of the Institute for Independent Study, the male faculty at Harvard had a lot of say over who was admitted. So after Connie Smith and sometimes another person would interview each potential fellow, they would write a little report where they would recommend acceptance, or they would write some notes on how the applicant had interviewed, and then they would send it to a male scholar in the discipline at Harvard for his approval. And so I thought that was very striking to me, that Walter Jackson Bate, is the one who said, yes, Anne Sexton should be accepted. And I wonder if in some way, the fact that the program was still sort of going through the usual gatekeepers in terms of prestige or accomplishment kind of allowed it to avoid what this astute questioner has asked, which is, if it's only women applying and being interviewed by women, is this how serious is this? I wonder if that method of selecting people kind of elevated the prestige of the program a little bit.
Yes, that's very, very insightful. There are a lot of questions that have come in asking if you think there's still a need for a program like the one you described.
It is such a good question, and I think about it every day. I'm not joking, and I think that's possibly a kind of pandemic thought as well. In part because what we're hearing so much these days is about how in heterosexual couples there remains a kind of unequal division of labor, where women are doing more of the domestic work and the childcare, and this is happening at the same time that women are asked to be working full-time, not even asked, but often need to be working full-time. Most families actually need 2 full incomes to have anything like financial security in this country right now. And so the idea that you might be granted, a space away from your family to do your work right now is just kind of very enticing. This is what an exciting prospect. But I think, the way I tend to think about it, and I think this is informed in part by my work as a teacher at Harvard, is that universities play a hugely important role in society, but they're not islands. They don't exist alone. And so many of the problems, the inequalities, the sort of challenges for different portions of a student body, portions of a workforce, portions of a population, I think really do need to be addressed at a broader level than just a single institution. So if there were to be a similar institution as the Institute for Independent Study, it would be wonderful, I think, for the 24 women or so who got to go. But I also just think, there are such big problems with the way we support families, the way we support, or frankly, don't support childcare. The fact that childcare is incredibly expensive and there's so little federal and state support for it. the way healthcare is so inaccessible to so many Americans, never mind sort of a living wage. I think if I were to, become the social engineer at this moment, I think I would be focusing my desires and my energies on some of those initiatives, because I think they would make the benefits of something like the Institute would be felt by so many more people. Yeah. Have an institute, but also have state-funded childcare would be my suggestion.
Great answer. So there are many questions about the idea of women-focused networks, and I want to invite you to just dream a little as you think about the possibility of having more of these spaces. There are questions about what specific tips you might have to women who want to create these kinds of networks. And the questioner is asking you to comment on mistakes that were made then that might be avoided now.
Oh, that's such a good question, right? The first thing that comes to mind, honestly, is from my work as a freelance journalist, where there have been kind of organic initiatives among women in journalism and media to form little professional networks. So I'm thinking of an editor of mine who was on a listserv called Editrix, I think, and it was just for women editors to kind of share tips or to talk about how to do, how to solicit or commission pieces, to send writers to each other rather than sort of just letting them, fend for themselves, or, letting each editor fend for themselves. And I think there's a good amount of stuff like that develops. And whenever I've been kind of lucky enough to stumble my way into one, honestly, the one that's made the most impact on my life was the roommates I lived with for most of graduate school, who all happened to be writers and all were women, and we were very helpful to each other. But I think the sort of mistake, or at least the inadequacy of those informal networks, is they rely on personal relationships, which can be really good because often you really want your friends to succeed and you want to help people out, but can also be complicated, especially when you're living with them and sharing a thin wall. And I think there is something to be said. And I think, what the Institute was able to do, even though there were those personal relationships there, it was also an institutional setting. There was a certain kind of facilitation that was happening very much outside just the networks of friendship and sort of common, living conditions or something like that. And I think the other sort of concern with these informal networks is they often reproduce relationships of power or exclusion that already exist. So, if you are a Harvard College graduate and you develop a magazine with other Harvard College graduates, the first people you will think to commission to write for your magazine are probably going to be other Harvard graduates. And this is probably going to be true even if it is, a group of Harvard College female graduates, who are thinking of female writers from the college. And there's, the magazine would probably be very good and very interesting, but it's actually still a pretty narrow network. And so I think, if you are thinking about establishing professional networks, especially professional networks that are supposed to sort of equalize or deal with some inequalities in an industry, I think you do want to be thinking about how to reach beyond your circle of friends. Even though my book is about friendship, I also think there's a limit to what friendship can do.
Oh, it's an absolutely critical point to make because there's such a literature about how those friend and informal and formal networks growing out of higher education tend to not identify talent that is outside those circles. And so thank you for saying that. There's a question about the Sexton Human relationship. Someone says, it sounds like they were riffing off each other's works. Can an argument be made that some of the work would not have existed but for the relationship in the program?
That's a fascinating counterfactual. It is very hard, given how closely they work together, it is very hard for me to imagine their work succeeding in the way it did without each other. So they started working together when they were both pretty early in their poetic careers. I think Kumin had published some sort of light verse in the Saturday Evening Post and newspapers like that. Sexton had basically just started writing after watching a public television show about the sonnet and sort of just said, oh, this is interesting, let me try that. Kumin provided her with the kind of literary education that she, as someone who didn't go to college, didn't have herself. And Sexton was a wonderful reader of Kumin's poetry. One of the most interesting parts of my research was actually looking at their notes and annotations on each other's drafts and seeing where they said, change this word, this line really works, love this image, I don't think you should end it here. I think, the idea that they were riffing off each other is a really interesting way to put it, because one thing that was so remarkable about their collaboration is how they very much acknowledge each other's separateness. They never tried to make the other's poetry sound identical. So they inspired each other almost in terms of productivity as opposed to sort of similar theme or similar style or similar form. The idea was, oh, you're writing poetry and I really like it, so I should write some poetry that you really like. And they allowed each other to sort of have those very different orientations to the poem, very, very different voices. I also think that without the sort of emotional support they gave each other, it's very hard for me to imagine their careers unfolding the way they did, especially the support that Kumin offered to Sexton, who had much more difficulty with her mental health and with being a mother while also sort of being an artist and a poet. And Kumin was a more sort of stabilizing, nurturing sort of presence in her life that I think must have been incredibly important to her productivity as an artist.
Great. Maggie, there are questions about Mariana Panetta. With whom did she form her closest relationships while at the Institute? And there is a question about whether the Institute has any of her sculptures. I can answer that one.
Sure, if you want to take the sculpture question.
No, they're beautiful. Come and see them when you next venture out into this side of campus. Can you speak about the question of her friendships? And this person also wants to know where her studio was, where she worked.
Yes, yeah. So Pineda, her closest collaborator was probably her husband, Radcliffe, who was also a sculptor. He always maintained, he sort of got a little bit more critical attention throughout his career. He always maintained that she was the better sculptor and the better artist. And he, for that very reason, they had a home in Brookline. They'd come to Brookline after traveling a bit for various teaching appointments and apprenticeships. And he gave her the better studio. So she had a beautiful studio, big, sun-filled, in their home. And then he worked out in the garage. And were very determined to leave each other alone to work, in part because they once shared a studio and they couldn't get anything done because they were bumping into each other. I mean, one thing I learned about sculpting is it's an incredibly laborious physical process, and you actually need a lot of space and room, and you're moving around and you're sort of lifting things, and you actually need a good amount of space to do this. So they would work separately and would call each other in when something was finally ready to be seen. Among the women at the Institute, Pineda and Olsen became very, very close. She also became close with Olsen's daughter, Kathy. And those relationships were maintained throughout her life until her death in the early 90s. She stayed very close to both Olsens. And that, I asked Julie Olsen, Tillie's daughter, I said, what do you think it was that drew the two of them together? And she said something like, well, why do you fall in love with anyone? It's love. There's a certain mystery to it. But I think if I were, to put on my historian hat and kind of press, they shared a political orientation. So Olsen was a leftist labor organizer. She'd been a young communist for a period in the 1930s. Pineda did not have those political affiliations, but she was the daughter of a woman who had been involved in civil rights activism fairly early and had been part of that scene outside of Chicago. And so she also had a real awareness of social justice issues and inequality. And I think that they sort of had a similar worldview in that way, that they were attentive to those kinds of issues. And they used to socialize with their husbands and, sit around debating how, by the mid-1960s, like things were not sort of going their way and how the world could become a better and more equal place.
I'm glad you mentioned that because it begins to answer a very good question, and we'll end with this one, where there is a comparison of the equivalent to the Blue Stocking Circle in London, where this person notes that the Blues asserted a female right to literature, but they stopped short of making political claims. And she is wondering whether the women that you are describing did in fact make political claims and make them in particular on behalf of women.
That's such a great question. One of the challenges when you write about the politics of art, right, is that art is always a little bit slippery in terms of the political claims it makes because it's not an argument, right? So I think I would argue, because I get to argue as the critic, that a sculpture like Pineda's Prelude, which is a life-size sculpture of a woman in labor, is making a political claim in some way. It's saying labor, a woman giving birth, is a fit subject for fine art. It can be really beautiful. This is not something that has to happen sort of off in hospitals away from, the public eye. This can be something that is looked at and understood and adored. And so I think there were ways that some of the representations that they offered in their art of women's lives as mothers, as lovers, as aging bodies were political in a sense. But they had different relationships to politics and different relationships to feminism. So some of them, Pineda and Olsen, considered themselves feminists and were open about that, and that was part of their way in the world. And Sexton did not consider herself a feminist and hated to be anthologized with feminist poets. Even though many of her readers found her poems to be very sort of feminist in a certain respect. And I wonder if some of this anxiety about how political to be has to do with being an artist. How you see your work as sort of speaking for itself. But I think some of it is also of the time where feminism wasn't actually yet a sort of word that everyone was willing to adopt or understood it to be describing the same thing. And I remember interviewing a historian who was part of this inaugural class at the Institute. And the way she put it to me, which I think is a nice way to think about this project and this era, is she said, what we were doing was feminism without the word. It was feminism before there was a word for it. And so I think that's kind of a nice way to think about their work and their project together.
Excellent, and a nice point on which to end. We could go on, but I'm afraid we have to bring this session to a close. Thank you so much, Maggie, for being with us today. Thank you for sharing your fascinating and thoughtful work. This was just fantastic. I also want to thank our audience for your excellent questions, and I hope you will join us for our next book talk that will be on Tuesday, July 28th, when I'll speak with the author and former Radcliffe Fellow, Michael Pollan, about his new audiobook called Caffeine: How Coffee and Tea Created the Modern World. You can find more information about that event and our upcoming events with videos of our past programs at radcliffe.harvard.edu. Thank you for joining us.